Under a sky the colour of tarnished silver, a lone carriage climbs toward Hawthorne Manor, a house that breathes in hushes and keeps its doors locked against the living. Sarah Langdon arrives with nothing but her dignity and a governess's post, greeted by a colonel whose courtesy hides a storm, and corridors that whisper of a wing no one enters. A shutter rattles. Footsteps falter above. The past tightens its grip, and a forbidden truth presses against the walls, begging to be heard. Before love can bloom, an impossible choice rises, duty or desire, silence or courage. Tell us, where are you listening from tonight? And what do you love most about period romances, forbidden secrets, fierce redemption, or love that returns against all odds? North Carolina, spring of the year 1851. The mountains held their breath beneath a sky the color of tarnished silver. Mist slithered over the pines like ghosts returning to haunt their homes, and the wind carried the scent of wet earth and forgotten things. On the narrow road that curved like a question mark through the hills, a solitary carriage creaked forward, pulled by two weary horses and driven by a man too old to speak of hope. Inside the carriage, Sarah Langdon sat with gloved hands folded tightly over her lap. She wore a modest traveling dress of slate blue wool, its high collar starched with convent precision, and a plain bonnet tied beneath her chin. Her dark brown hair, parted and pinned in a chaste chignon, had not moved during the journey. Her eyes, hazel, deep and observant, had studied every passing tree, every shadowed ridge, with the quiet vigilance of a woman who had learned to expect little and dream even less. Hawthorne Manor appeared not with grandeur, but with gravity. Its stone facade loomed from the fog like a castle left behind by time. Ivy clung to its walls like the arms of the dead, and tall windows stared out blankly, blind to sunlight. It was a place that seemed to sigh rather than breathe, and as the carriage wheels cracked over gravel, Sarah felt the first shiver of unease curl beneath her ribs. The driver, a grey-bearded man with one eye clouded by age, helped her down with care, but offered no smile. As he handed her valise, he muttered without meeting her eyes, "Mind the east wing, miss. Doors there open to things best left closed." Before Sarah could ask what he meant, the driver tipped his hat and urged the horses forward. She was alone. The heavy oak door creaked open before she could knock. A woman in her 6th decade stood there, straight-backed and unsmiling, her dark dress high-necked and cinched, her mob cap as crisp as a blade. "Miss Langdon, I presume," she said. Her voice was low, not unkind, but carefully measured, like someone who had said too much in her youth and lived to regret it. "I am Mrs. Penwell, the housekeeper. You'll find Hawthorne expects discipline and discretion. I trust you are capable of both." "I am," Sarah replied quietly. The entrance hall was dim, lined with somber portraits and long faded rugs. The air smelled of beeswax, old books, and the lingering smoke of a fire long since extinguished. Somewhere a clock ticked, the sound hollow against the silence. Sarah was shown to her quarters, small, clean, and north-facing. A single candle burned beside the bed, casting gold onto the worn wood of the floorboards. Beyond the narrow window, the trees rustled like skirts in mourning. Later that afternoon, summoned by Mrs. Penwell, Sarah descended the grand staircase to meet the master of the house. Colonel Jonathan Blackwell stood near the hearth of the drawing room, his frame tall and straight, as if still shaped by military command. He wore a dark frock coat, immaculately tailored, and his hair, black threaded with early silver, was brushed back from a face carved by loss. His steel-grey eyes held shadows, as though he had seen too much and spoken of it too little. He bowed. "Miss Langdon, I trust your journey was without hardship?" "It was long but uneventful," she answered, folding her hands in front of her. Her voice was soft but steady. The colonel's gaze lingered on her for a moment too long, not in impropriety, but as if trying to decipher something only he could sense. "You will be instructing Josette in reading, numbers and manners appropriate to her station," he said. "She is a quiet child, but keen when she feels safe." He said nothing else before turning to gaze into the fire. Sarah felt dismissed, though not rudely. It was as if speaking cost him something, and he was always calculating whether the price was worth paying. The first encounter with Josette took place in the solarium, a room filled with pale light and dust-covered roses. The child sat by the window, her small figure dwarfed by a chair too large for her. She wore a simple cotton dress, faded lilac in color, and her light brown curls were held back by a ribbon. Her eyes, grey-green and solemn, studied Sarah with the careful silence of a wounded bird. "Hello, Josette," Sarah said gently. "I'm Miss Langdon. I'm here to be your governess." The girl said nothing, but her eyes did not leave Sarah's face. It was only when Sarah took a book from the shelf and sat on the carpet beside her, rather than across the room, that the girl's hand crept slowly forward, touching the edge of Sarah's skirt like one might touch water to test its warmth. In that moment, something unseen shifted. That night, Sarah wandered the halls alone. She wished to memorize the layout of the house, but soon realized Hawthorne had its own will. Corridors twisted unexpectedly. Doorways that seemed to promise one room opened into another. She paused at the base of a narrow stairwell leading upward into shadow. A rusted keyhole glinted beneath the handle, and the door was bolted shut. She raised her hand to touch it. A soft groan echoed from the other side. Startled, she turned to find Mrs. Penwell behind her. "That part of the house is closed," the housekeeper said sharply. "Best not to go poking about, Miss Langdon. Curiosity can be costly in places like this." Sarah inclined her head. "Of course, Mrs. Penwell." But as she walked back to her room, she could not shake the feeling that the walls of Hawthorne Manor were not silent by nature. They were silent by command, and something behind those locked doors had not yet finished speaking. That night, as rain whispered against the windows and wind moved through the trees like a lament, Sarah sat by the candlelight, pen in hand, and wrote to no one in particular. "There is a sorrow in this house that does not speak, but it listens, and I fear it waits." She folded the page and placed it beneath her pillow. Then she blew out the candle, and somewhere, far above, a door groaned softly and closed. The days at Hawthorne Manor did not pass so much as unfold, slowly and with ceremony, like the turning of brittle parchment in an old unread book. The air itself seemed governed by time's slower hand. Morning light crept shyly through the tall windows, and the chiming of the great hall clock reverberated like an echo from another century. Sarah Langdon had been at the manor for nearly 3 weeks. Her presence, once foreign and tentative, had begun to weave itself gently into the rhythm of the house. She woke before sunrise, dressed in silence, and braided her hair with the practiced hands of someone who had lived long in the discipline of rules. Her dresses, modest in cut, muted in color, whispered through the corridors, announcing her neither as mistress nor servant, but as something suspended delicately in between. It was with Josette that she first found the threads of belonging. The child had been reluctant at first, responding with nods or solemn stares rather than words. But Sarah, with the patience of a soul who understood silence, had waited, not with insistence, but with presence. She read aloud from La Fontaine and spoke to Josette in soft French, the language of her infancy. She brought her dried lavender sachets to place in her drawer and encouraged her to draw her dreams with colored pastels. One rainy afternoon, Josette slipped her small hand into Sarah's without a word and pulled her toward the solarium. There, beneath the pale grey dome of glass, they watched the storm blur the garden beyond. And as thunder rumbled in the distance, the child turned to her and whispered, "Maman used to say that rain was the sky washing its face before sleep." It was the first full sentence Josette had spoken in her presence. Sarah's heart ached with quiet joy. It was that same afternoon that she came across the portrait. In a narrow corridor between the music room and the library, nearly hidden behind a hanging tapestry, she discovered a painting, dust-veiled and forgotten. It was a woman, fair-haired and noble in bearing, seated at a pianoforte. Her gaze held a kind of defiant fragility, as though she had once fought against the world and lost. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "Eleanor Blackwell," said a voice behind her. She turned. Colonel Jonathan Blackwell stood in the threshold, one hand resting lightly on the doorframe. His expression was unreadable. "She was radiant once," he said, his voice low. "French blood on her mother's side. Music was her religion." Sarah studied his face. He did not speak of the dead with grief, but with reverence and something else. Regret, perhaps, or guilt that refused to be named. "I found Josette's French quite natural," she said softly. "She told me her mother spoke the same." "She did," he replied. "Josette's mother was a nursemaid to Eleanor. They were raised in the same household in Rouen. Marie was loyal, graceful, kind. When illness took her, I gave my word I would protect her daughter." "She seems to love this place," Sarah said, choosing her words carefully, "despite its quiet." Jonathan looked away, toward the window where the rain was beginning to silver the glass. "Hawthorne is not a place built for joy, Miss Langdon," he said. "It was built for legacy." She said nothing, and for a moment the only sound was the tapping of rain. Later that week, he joined her and Josette during their morning walk through the southern garden. It was a space slightly less somber than the rest of the estate. Hedges neatly trimmed, violets and lilies beginning to bloom. Jonathan walked with hands behind his back, his cane unused but ever present. He asked about Josette's lessons, her numbers, her reading. Sarah answered plainly, but with a quiet pride in the child's progress. Josette skipped ahead, chasing a yellow butterfly. "You've done more for her in a fortnight," he said without looking at Sarah, "than I have in a year." "She needed someone to see her," Sarah replied gently. His eyes flickered toward hers then, briefly but with weight. "And what of you, Miss Langdon? Have you ever been seen?" The question caught her off guard. Her lips parted, but no answer came. It was not a flirtation. It was something far more dangerous, a question that looked inward, not outward. She excused herself after the walk and spent the afternoon in the library. Books lined the walls like sentinels, their spines faded by age. She pulled down a volume of poetry and ran her fingers along the pages, trying to quiet the tremor in her breath. His voice lingered, not in her ears, but in her chest. That night, a shutter on the upper floor began to rattle. It had not done so before. Sarah rose from her bed and lit her candle, stepping into the hallway. The noise stopped as suddenly as it began. She turned and thought for the briefest of seconds that she saw the edge of a gown slip behind the far corner. But when she followed, there was nothing, only the locked stairwell and the shadows it guarded. The next morning, she asked Mrs. Penwell whether the attic was ever used. The housekeeper, stirring her tea with precise, silent movements, replied, "No one goes there." Sarah held her gaze, and for the first time she saw something flicker behind Agatha's eyes. Not fear, not guilt, but memory, deep and unwilling. "Is there a reason?" Sarah asked carefully. Mrs. Penwell stood and placed the teacup aside. "Some parts of a house are meant to be closed, Miss Langdon, like chapters best left unread." Sarah did not press further. Days continued, each with small shifts. Jonathan lingered longer in the drawing room when she read aloud to Josette. His eyes would close, not in sleep, but as if listening became prayer. When he did speak, his words were deliberate, never wasted. He asked about New Orleans, about convent life, about her impressions of the local flora. He never asked about her heart, but sometimes she wondered if he already knew. One evening after dinner, he asked her to play something at the pianoforte. Sarah hesitated. "I don't play well," she said. "You play," he countered gently. "That is enough." She sat. Her fingers trembled. The keys were slightly out of tune, the bench stiff, but she played. A lullaby her mother used to hum before sorrow overtook their home. A song without words. When she finished, the silence felt heavy, not hollow. Jonathan rose from his chair, crossed the room, and stood beside her. He did not touch her, only rested his hand on the polished edge of the instrument. That, he said softly, was not unskilled. That was honesty. Sarah looked up. His face was lit only by the firelight. For a moment, time seemed to stop between them, not in anticipation but in understanding. She rose and curtsied. "Good evening, Colonel." And she left the room, her heart beating not fast, but deep. That night she could not sleep. The air felt different, as though something had shifted in the bones of the house. She sat by her window, watching the moon move across the sky. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called once, then again. Hawthorne Manor remained silent, but within that silence, something had begun to stir. Not noise, not secrets, something softer, something like hope. The hills of North Carolina had always carried their storms like sacred rites, solemn, relentless, and impossible to ignore. On the night the truth first tried to speak, the skies wept with fury, and Hawthorne Manor stood like a dark cathedral awaiting confession. Thunder rolled over the rooftops like ancient drums. Lightning split the clouds and bled through the tall windows of the manor, illuminating its corridors in violent flashes of silver and shadow. The wind clawed at the eaves with wild fingers, rattling panes and shutters as if demanding entry. In her modest chamber beneath the north gable, Sarah Langdon sat at her writing desk, the flame of her oil lamp flickering in protest. Her pen hovered over paper, unmoving. The ink had long dried upon the tip, but her thoughts remained restless. She had tried to write, tried to drown her unease in the rhythm of sentences, but the storm outside had a rhythm of its own, louder, older, and far more persuasive. She had grown accustomed to the sounds of hawthorn, the creak of floorboards, the hush of velvet curtains stirring without breeze, the muffled steps of Mrs. Penwell's practical shoes echoing down morning halls. But this night, something was different. It began as a low moan, so faint that Sarah first mistook it for the wind itself. Yet it returned, longer, rising into a wail that no storm could claim. Her heart tightened. It came again, not from the garden, not from below, from above, from the east wing. She rose slowly, wrapping her shawl tightly around her shoulders. She stepped into the corridor barefoot, the stone floor cold beneath her soles. The storm howled louder now, like some furious choir surrounding the house, and still the sound, wailing, desperate, undeniably human, called from behind the forbidden doors. The stairwell was dark. The candle trembled in her grip. Each step creaked like a whispered warning, but she did not turn back. At the landing she reached the bolted door, the one Mrs. Penwell had warned her from. Her hand hovered over the latch. Then a voice, startlingly close. "You should not be here." Mrs. Agatha Penwell stood at the end of the hall, her figure framed by the faint glow of her own lamp. Her white cap was slightly askew, and for the first time since Sarah's arrival, the older woman's composure was fractured. "I heard someone," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "It was the storm, nothing more." "It was not the storm." Agatha's lips thinned. "You are not the first to hear things in this house, but you must learn. Some noises do not require answers. Some truths serve no one." "I do not fear the truth," Sarah whispered. "Then you are a rare creature," the housekeeper replied. Her voice held no cruelty, only the weariness of one who had carried too much, too long. "But it is not your burden to bear." The older woman stepped forward and gently took the candle from Sarah's hands. "Go back to your room." Sarah did not move. She looked once more at the bolted door, then turned, the weight of questions clinging to her like wet wool. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving a pale, bruised sky in its wake. Rain still clung to the windows, but the wind had stilled. At breakfast, Colonel Blackwell did not speak of the night before. His hands remained folded over the handle of his cane, his eyes fixed upon the fire. Sarah studied him, seeking something, anything that might suggest he had heard it too, but he gave nothing away. Josette, as always, was silent. She picked at her toast, her hair slightly damp and her eyes distant. When Sarah rose from the table, Jonathan finally spoke. "Miss Langdon, a shipment arrived this morning. Books and personal effects from Madame Moreau's estate. You may find them of use for Josette's instruction. I've asked Mrs. Penwell to place them in the schoolroom." "I shall look at them after lessons," she replied softly. He inclined his head, but his eyes remained fixed on the fire. The boxes had been neatly stacked along the west wall of the schoolroom, bound with old twine and marked in delicate French handwriting. Sarah untied them slowly, lifting out well-worn books with soft leather covers and pressed flowers still hiding between pages. At the bottom of the third box, wrapped in linen, she found it. A diary, thin and bound in faded green velvet. The initials MM were stitched along the spine. She opened it with reverence. The handwriting was delicate and feminine, but strong. It spoke of seasons at Hawthorne, of Eleanor Blackwell's laughter, of Josette's infancy, of music drifting through corridors and the scent of orange blossom in spring. But as the pages turned, the tone shifted. Entries grew shorter, phrases more desperate. "Eleanor has not been well since the child. The dreams disturb her. She speaks in French to shadows. The colonel pretends, but I see his fear. He hides her away. Agatha brings trays she never touches. No one must know. No one." Sarah's fingers trembled. She turned another page, but it was torn, and the rest of the diary had been violently ripped away. She sat in the schoolroom long after the sun had moved past the window. Outside, the world remained indifferent. Trees swayed, birds sang, life went on. But inside Sarah's chest, a quiet war began. That evening, she did not descend for supper. She stood at her window, eyes fixed on the east wing. The shutters there had not rattled today. The silence was louder than before. A knock at her door broke the stillness. It was Colonel Blackwell. "I was told you were unwell," he said. "May I?" She stepped aside. He entered, not with the ease of a master, but with the hesitation of a man unsure of his welcome. "I am not ill," she said, "only tired." He looked at her for a long moment. "You are a woman of strong will, Miss Langdon." She did not answer. "I was told," he continued, "that you were near the East Wing last night." Her heart skipped. "Yes. You must not go there again." He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. And yet the words carried the weight of command. "I heard someone," she said, her voice low but clear. "There was no one." Her jaw tensed. "Do not ask me to believe what I know I heard." Jonathan exhaled and turned toward the window. His posture faltered for a moment, just enough for her to see the truth. He was weary, not in body, but in soul. "Some things," he said quietly, "must be buried, Miss Langdon, for the sake of those who remain." She stepped forward, her voice trembling with restraint. "And what of those who are buried before their time? What of the ones locked behind doors while the rest of us pretend the house is whole?" He turned to her, and in his eyes she saw pain, not the pain of anger, the pain of memory. "She is dead," he said. "Is she?" Sarah asked. He did not answer, but something in him flinched. He left without another word. That night, Sarah lay awake as wind stirred through the trees again, softer this time, like the breath of something that waited. The diary rested beneath her pillow. The walls of Hawthorne were still, but Sarah no longer believed in silence. The month of May arrived with hesitant warmth. Wild roses began to bloom along the weathered stone walls of Hawthorne Manor, their petals pale and trembling in the morning breeze. The air was heavy with the perfume of damp earth and old promises, and the trees whispered softly, as if aware that change was approaching. Change slow and solemn, like the shifting of the tides beneath a sky filled with secrets. Sarah Langdon walked daily through the garden with Josette, her gloved hand wrapped gently around the child's smaller fingers. The girl spoke more now, her voice still timid, but steady. She had begun to hum again. Little French lullabies no one had taught her, melodies that had remained hidden in her bones like forgotten heirlooms. Sometimes, when Sarah brushed her hair at night, Josette would rest her head against her arm and whisper, "I feel safe when you're here." Those words clung to Sarah long after she left the child's room. They stayed with her as she sat alone at the window, watching the candlelight flicker against the tall shadows of the hall. They echoed in her thoughts when Colonel Blackwell passed by in silence, nodding with that somber gravity that seemed both respectful and restrained. He spoke more now, though never much, but each word he offered carried a weight that made it unforgettable. It was on one such morning, under a sky streaked with gold and pearl, that the Colonel invited her for a walk alone, something he had not done before. Sarah accepted, though her pulse trembled beneath the surface of her composure. They walked side by side along the orchard path behind the stables, where the apple trees had just begun to blush with early blossoms. Birds chirped overhead, indifferent to human matters, and the grass was still dewy from the night. "I remember when this orchard was planted," Jonathan said, his voice quieter than usual. "My father wanted it for show. The fruit was never sweet." Sarah offered a soft smile. "Sometimes beauty refuses to be useful." His eyes moved to hers, and he studied her for a moment before looking away. "That's a lesson I learned too late." They continued in silence for a few steps before he stopped beneath one of the larger trees. The breeze stirred the branches above them, and a single blossom drifted down, landing in the crook of his sleeve. "There is something I must say," he began, "and I do not ask for an answer today. Only that you hear me as a man stripped of pretense." Sarah waited, still and attentive, her breath suspended. He turned to her fully. The morning light softened the sharp lines of his face, but did nothing to conceal the vulnerability in his expression. "I have lived surrounded by shadows, Miss Langdon. I have allowed them to become my company, my counsel, and my sentence. Yet since your arrival, I have known a stillness that is not silence. You speak little, but you see much. You ask nothing, but offer everything." Her hands folded over her waist, heart pounding. "I do not offer you wealth, nor romance in the sense the poets praise. What I offer is peace, a home, a place where you are needed not only by a child, but by a man who has forgotten what it is to hope." Sarah could feel the world narrowing, her heart, the orchard, the entire estate, all drawing inward to this single moment. "I would ask you," he said slowly, "to become my wife." For a long moment, she could not speak. His eyes held hers, not demanding, not pleading, but open, unarmored. When she finally answered, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes." He bowed his head, and a breath he had been holding escaped him. "Then we will begin again, quietly." That afternoon, Sarah stood alone in the upstairs chamber that had once belonged to a long-gone aunt of the family. Mrs. Penwell had laid out a simple ivory gown, once worn by a cousin for a winter wedding. Its lace yellowed slightly with time. Sarah touched the fabric with reverence. Agatha stood in the doorway. "She would have wanted you to wear it," the housekeeper said, though her voice lacked warmth. Sarah turned. "Did you know her well?" "Eleanor was beauty and fire," Agatha replied. "But fire consumes." It was the first time she had spoken the name aloud. The silence between them stretched. "She is dead, then?" Sarah asked carefully. Agatha's gaze did not flinch. "She is gone." Then she crossed the room, took the gown from the bed, and held it out. Sarah slipped behind the changing screen and began to dress. Her hands trembled at the buttons. When she stepped out, Agatha looked at her without smiling. She muttered something beneath her breath, something in Latin. "A prayer?" Sarah asked. Agatha nodded. "For protection." "From whom?" The housekeeper did not answer. The following days passed in hushed arrangements. No announcements were made in town, but word, as it always does, found a way. At the general store, the baker's wife whispered that Hawthorne was preparing for a new mistress. At the chapel, the pew behind the colonel's remained empty. Left that way on purpose, they said, out of respect or perhaps superstition. The gossip spoke in half-truths, that the governess had bewitched the master, that he was marrying to cover some scandal, that the child wasn't truly an orphan. Sarah heard none of it directly, but she felt it, in the sidelong glances, in the sudden hush when she entered the parlor with Josette, in the way the seamstress's hands fumbled slightly as she adjusted the sleeves of the gown. One evening, Sarah sat with Jonathan by the fire, Josette asleep in her lap. He reached over and gently touched the edge of Sarah's shawl. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "Of what?" she murmured. "Of becoming part of a place where the past is louder than the present." She looked into his eyes. "Only if I am asked to pretend I cannot hear it." He nodded slowly. Then, after a moment, said, "You are not being asked to forget, only to forgive." She did not reply. Forgiveness, she knew, could not be forced, but neither could love, and what was blooming between them, she realized, was not built on illusion. It was something else, something born from stillness and sorrow, something that asked for no more than presence. That night, as she prepared for bed, she looked at herself in the mirror. Her face was calm, her cheeks touched with a faint color that had not been there weeks before. But her eyes, they remained cautious. She opened the drawer beside her bed. The diary of Madame Moreau still lay within. She had not read it again, but its weight, like all truths, remained. As she closed the drawer, the candlelight flickered, and the wind stirred faintly against the shutters. Sarah lay down with her hands crossed over her heart. Outside, the moon rose pale and watchful over the manor, and somewhere, in a place where no one spoke, a silence stirred again. The night before the wedding, Hawthorne Manor breathed with a stillness too perfect to trust. The air was heavy, saturated with the scent of jasmine drifting in from the gardens, and a hush had fallen upon every corridor as though the very walls awaited a verdict they already feared. In her room, Sarah Langdon sat before her mirror, her shawl still draped over her shoulders, her hair only half unpinned. A lamp flickered gently on the nightstand, its flame casting a golden halo against the wallpaper's faded floral pattern. The silence around her was deceptive, too dense, too obedient. She felt it press upon her skin, coil around her breath. The wedding gown, newly pressed and laid upon the bed, shimmered faintly in the candlelight like a ghost anticipating its entrance. But Sarah could not sleep. Her heart was restless in a way she could not name, as if the house itself had turned its eyes toward her and whispered, "You are not ready to know." She rose and crossed to the window. The moon hung low and round above the trees, silvering the orchard and the broken stone path. Not a leaf stirred, not a nightbird called. And then it came, a sound so sudden, so piercing, that it seemed to rend the night in two. A scream, not the wind, not an owl, not a dream. A human scream, womanly, raw, full of madness and agony. Sarah froze. It rose again, clearer now, a shriek of such primal despair that her body reacted before her mind could reason. She grabbed her lamp and fled into the hallway, bare feet moving swiftly across the cold wood floors. Her hand trembled as she held the flame high, casting warped shadows onto the walls as she climbed the narrow back stairs that led to the east wing. She knew where it had come from. She had always known. She passed the bolted door, the one she had seen but not dared approach in the daylight, and paused. The air here was colder, older. The scream had stopped, but behind the door she could hear something. Breathing, a soft muttering. The creak of floorboards as someone paced or stumbled. She lifted the latch. It was locked. Behind her, the sound of quick steps on the stairs startled her. She turned sharply to find Mrs. Penwell, her face pale and furious, her nightcap askew and her eyes filled with terror. "What do you think you are doing?" the housekeeper hissed. "There's someone in there," Sarah cried, her voice low but firm. "Turn back, now!" "Who is she?" "Go to your room." But Sarah stood her ground. "No, not this time. No more silence." Agatha looked at her then, not with anger, but with defeat. with the sorrow of a woman who has carried a burden for too long and is now too tired to carry it further. "She was once the mistress of this house," she whispered. "Now, she is a prisoner of it." And then, without another word, she reached into the folds of her apron and withdrew a key. Sarah's hand closed around it. She turned the lock. The door creaked open slowly, as if reluctant to reveal what lay beyond. The room was dark, save for a sliver of moonlight that fell through a small, dust-covered window. The air smelled of neglect, old wood, mildew, the faint trace of lavender, long faded. The walls were papered in what had once been elegant floral print, now torn and stained. Furniture covered in white sheets loomed like ghosts. And then she saw her. In the far corner of the room, hunched near the fireplace, was a woman. Her golden hair was matted and tangled, falling over her shoulders like wild vines. Her dress, once ivory silk, was yellowed and torn, the hem black with dirt. Her arms were thin, too thin, and her hands shook as she rocked herself back and forth, muttering under her breath in French. When she looked up, Sarah recoiled. The woman's eyes were wide, blue, unblinking. Once beautiful, they now gleamed with something unhinged. Her face was gaunt, her lips chapped. But beneath the ruin, Sarah saw it, the ghost of the woman in the portrait. "Eleanor," she whispered. The woman shrieked again, a sound that did not belong to any world Sarah knew. Behind her, footsteps, heavy, slow. Colonel Jonathan Blackwell appeared in the doorway, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his waistcoat hastily pulled on. He looked not at Sarah, but at the woman. "Eleanor," he said softly. The woman fell silent at the sound of his voice. Her eyes flickered toward him. For a moment her face seemed to soften, her lips twitching into the hint of a smile. Then she began to sob. Sarah turned to him. Her voice was barely audible, but each word struck like a hammer. "You said she was dead." Jonathan's eyes closed. "I wanted to believe it," he said. "For a time I did." Sarah stepped back from him, the lamp trembling in her hand. "You locked her away like an animal." "She was ill," he said, his voice breaking. "After the baby died, she changed. She screamed for nights. She would strike out without warning. She set the nursery curtains on fire. She tried to drown herself in the reflecting pool. The physician said she should be sent to an asylum." "Then why didn't you?" Sarah's voice cracked. "Because I loved her," he said, "and because I was a coward. I thought, if I kept her close, I could protect her, or at least the memory of her." He stepped further into the room. Eleanor whimpered. "I gave her music, books, sunlight, but nothing reached her. Eventually, I stopped trying." Sarah's throat tightened. Her heart was a storm of fury and sorrow. "And you allowed me to fall in love with you," she whispered, "under falsehoods, in a house built on secrets. I never intended to deceive you," he said, "but I didn't know how to speak of this, of her. How does a man confess such a failure?" "You don't," she said, backing toward the door. "You bury it." Agatha stood in the hall, eyes wet with unshed tears. "Miss Langdon," she began, but Sarah could not bear to hear another word. She ran, down the stairs, through the hall, past the parlor where the fire had burned low, past the gown still laid upon the bed, like an offering to a future that no longer existed. She reached her room and tore open the wardrobe, pulling garments into a carpet bag with shaking hands. Her bonnet, her shoes, her gloves, nothing more. In the mirror, she saw herself, pale, disheveled, her eyes burning with betrayal. There was no ceremony to her departure, no carriage summoned, no goodbyes offered. She fled into the night on foot, the wind biting at her cheeks, her tears vanishing into the dark. The gates of Hawthorne loomed ahead like sentinels, and beyond them, the road that led away from everything she had believed could be hers. Behind her, the house stood silent again, but this time it would never be silent in the same way. For truth, once spoken, does not return to sleep. The road was never meant to welcome women like her. It did not soften under her feet, nor did it part the mist to ease her passage. It offered no comfort, no shelter, no promise. It simply stretched forward, muddy, winding, indifferent, vanishing into a grey horizon painted with drizzle and pine. And so, with a heart split open and stitched only by dignity, Sarah Langdon walked. She walked away from Hawthorne Manor with nothing more than a carpetbag and a heart full of broken vows. No carriage bore her name, no servant trailed behind. Only the sound of her steps, muffled by the wet earth and the cold bite of morning air against her skin, kept her company as she moved through the unfamiliar landscape like a ghost who had buried herself. For days, perhaps weeks, time had blurred. She wandered from one village to another, her bonnet drooping with rain, her boots caked in dust. She slept where the night allowed, a stable once, the scent of hay clinging to her shawl for days after. A church pew another night, where her breath misted into the stone stillness beneath a cracked stained glass window. Her prayers, whispered into the darkness, were not for rescue, but for clarity, for a sign that the ache inside her chest would not consume her entirely. It was in one such town, tucked between fields of withering crops and a row of leaning chimneys, that she met a man named Mr. Elmore, a widower, a schoolmaster. His hands were ink-stained, and his smile shy. He noticed her when she sat alone at the inn, eating a bowl of broth in silence. He asked if she could read Latin. She answered with a full translation of the passage he tested her with. And so he offered her a position in the village school. She accepted, not with eagerness but with need. The school was a small, whitewashed building with crooked windows and an uneven floor. Her desk was splintered, the chalk brittle, the children unruly and bright-eyed. But she threw herself into the work with the fervor of a woman who needed something, anything to believe in. She taught them with kindness, with structure, with the quiet assurance of someone who had once known chaos and now desired only calm. She wore plain wool dresses and braided her hair tightly each morning. She smiled with reserve. She wept only in solitude. At night, she lit a single candle and wrote, not letters, not journal entries. She wrote fragments of dreams. Sentences about redemption, about longing, about love lost and not yet mourned. She never signed her name. The villagers grew fond of her in the polite way of rural folk. They nodded to her at market, left baskets of apples by her door, called her Miss Langdon, and never asked from where she'd come or to whom she once belonged. And for that, she was grateful. Mr. Elmore visited her often. He would bring her books, collections of poetry, treatises on education, stories with tidy endings. He would sit by her small fire and speak of his late wife in a tone stripped of sorrow. Once, after a spring rain, he brought her a single yellow rose, damp with dew. "I know you've lived through sorrow," he said. "So have I. And I would not ask you to forget, only to let someone else walk beside you now. It was not unkind, it was not untrue, but it was not love." She thanked him gently, and when he took her hand in his, she did not pull away, but neither did she lean in. And when he proposed, quietly, without ceremony, she looked into his kind eyes and said, "You deserve to be chosen fully, Mr. Elmore, not as a shelter from memory." He nodded, and though his lips pressed into a line, his pride remained intact. He never asked again. Seasons turned, spring folded into summer, and summer into a fragile autumn. Sarah walked daily to the school, her shawl gathered tight around her. She taught with devotion, but the fire in her lessons dimmed when she caught herself using metaphors drawn from another life. When the wind shifted just so, she would smell jasmine. When she saw a girl in the market plaiting her doll's hair, she would think of Josette's solemn eyes, the way her small fingers clung to her hand like ivy on stone. She dreamed of music, of lace resting on ivory shoulders, of a man who asked for forgiveness with his silence because words had failed him. And then one morning, the whisper found her. It arrived not as a letter nor as a messenger at her door, but through the careless conversation of two travelling merchants who paused for water near the school gates. "Hawthorne burned," one said, spitting into the dust. "Whole place lit up in the night. They say madness took her in the end, the mistress, the wife, whatever she was." Sarah stood behind the schoolhouse door, her breath suspended. "Man got out," the other added. "Blind now. Shame." They moved on. Sarah's legs gave way beneath her. That night she sat by her fire for hours, unmoving. Her candle melted into its dish. Her pen remained untouched. The past had caught up to her, not as vengeance, but as echo. 3 days later, the letter arrived. There was no envelope, no name, just a folded scrap of linen paper placed gently within her desk drawer, nestled between lesson plans and a pressed leaf she could not recall keeping. She opened it with hands that trembled like violins beneath a bow. One line only: "She is gone. I cannot see the dawn." She read it once, then again and again. The ink was faint, the handwriting familiar, formal, controlled, yet wounded. It bore no signature. It did not need one. She rose slowly and went to the window. Rain had begun to fall, gentle, persistent, washing the dust from the panes, the earth, her breath. Sarah placed the letter against her chest, and for the first time in many months, she allowed herself to weep, not for what had been lost, but for what remained unanswered. The wind that carried the news came bitter and dry, as though it had passed first through smoke and ruin before reaching the world beyond the hills. It arrived in whispers, at the market, in chapels, on the lips of travelling merchants too accustomed to tragedy to give it reverence. And yet, for those who had once stood beneath the towering shadow of Hawthorne Manor, the words clung like ash. The house is gone. All of it. Burned. They said it had lit the sky like a pyre, flames rising higher than the chimney stacks visible from the cliffs on the northern ridge. That the night air had turned crimson with heat, and the trees had hissed as their leaves blackened and curled. They said the east wing had gone first. That the fire had fed on it like a beast, long starved, devouring the walls, the floors, the curtains that had once silenced so many cries. They said a woman had screamed just once before the roof fell. And they said a man had emerged from the smoke, broken and blind, Colonel Jonathan Blackwell. He had been found near the southern terrace, one arm scorched to the elbow, eyes burned by heat and soot. His coat had been torn from his back as if in offering, and blood had marked his collar where shards of glass had kissed his throat. It was Mrs. Penwell who pulled him from the rubble. She had been in the servants' quarters when the blaze began and rushed through the smoke to find Josette, safe, unharmed, but trembling in her nightdress beneath the stairwell. She had gone back for Jonathan. She had not gone back for Eleanor. And so it was said that the lady of the house, the mad woman in the attic, had died as she lived, in silence, hidden and alone. Some believed it was an accident, that a candle left burning, a curtain caught too close to flame, had been the cause. Others believed differently. She knew, they said. She waited, and when the time came, she chose to burn. In the weeks that followed, nothing remained of the manor but scorched stone and memory. Crows nested in the blackened trees. The smell lingered long after the flames had died, of smoke, of wet soot, of secrets finally released into the wind. Hawthorne was no more. They did not return to town. Instead, Agatha took the child and the broken man to a small cottage nestled at the edge of a forest some miles away, a place once used as a hunting lodge, now forgotten by those who preferred clean stories and grand halls. There, the colonel lived not as a man, but as a shadow of one. He did not speak often. His eyes, once steel-grey and sharp, saw only darkness now. A band of linen covered them most days, though Josette would often take it off when he rested, as if wishing to see him as he had once been. His hands were still strong, though his left bore scars that reached from palm to shoulder. He no longer wore his uniform. His clothes were simple now, linen shirts with sleeves rolled to the elbow, wool coats without medals, boots softened by ash. Agatha kept the household with quiet devotion. She mended what could be mended. She cleaned, she cooked, she guided Josette through lessons as best she could, though the child's mind wandered often. And when night fell and silence blanketed the rooms like frost, she would bring him his tea and ask no questions. Jonathan spent much of his time seated near the hearth, his chair facing a window he could no longer see. He counted his steps carefully from each room to the next. He learned the feel of the walls, the edges of the table, the ridges in the floor. When he stumbled, he cursed, not aloud, but beneath his breath, biting his tongue until it bled. But in the evenings, when the light had faded and only the fire warmed the air, he would sit with a quill and parchment and write. He wrote letters, dozens of them, some short, some pages long. He never signed them. He never sent them. Each one began the same. You were right to leave. And somewhere, always the words, I failed her, I failed you, I failed myself. Josette would sit on the rug nearby, drawing circles on the edge of the carpet with a broken piece of chalk. Sometimes she would ask him to read a story, forgetting he could no longer see. Other times she would crawl into his lap and place her small hand on his cheek just to feel that he was still real. She no longer asked about the manor. But every morning, when Agatha brushed her hair and tied it back with a pale blue ribbon, she would look up and ask, "Will Miss Sarah come back today?" The question would hang in the air like mist, and the answer was always silence. One night, when the fire cracked low and the wind sighed through the shutters, Jonathan spoke aloud for the first time in days. I heard her voice. Agatha looked up from her knitting. "Sir?" "In the fire," he said. Before the beam fell, I heard Eleanor. But it wasn't a cry. It wasn't madness. It was something else. She said, "Forgive me." The housekeeper said nothing. After a pause, he added, "Or perhaps it was the fire itself." He fell silent again. In his sleep, he dreamed of her, not Eleanor, but Sarah. Her voice soft but firm, the weight of her presence in a room, the feel of her hand on Josette's shoulder, the scent of lavender when she passed by. He dreamed of the garden, of her laughter, which he had only heard once, and which had taken root in him like a seed determined to bloom. And he dreamed of the way she had looked at him the night he told her the truth, not with hatred, but with something worse, with disappointment. Morning came slow and cold. Outside, frost crept along the window panes. Agatha moved through the cottage with quiet purpose. Josette sat at the table, humming the tune Sarah used to sing at lessons. Jonathan sat in his chair, unmoving, letter clutched in his hand. Another note, another truth never spoken aloud. But this time, he did not place it with the others. He folded it. He turned his head toward the room and said, low and certain, "Agatha, send it." The old woman looked at him carefully. "Send it where?" He hesitated. "Wherever her name is still whispered with hope." And so, the letter left. And in its place, a silence returned, but not the same silence. This one held a breath, a pause, a waiting. The road to the cottage was narrow, overgrown, and hemmed in by trees that whispered with the weariness of winter's passing. It was not the kind of path meant for visitors. It did not beckon with promise or beauty. It waited in stillness, wrapped in branches like arms folded in prayer. Sarah Langdon walked it alone. She carried no letter in her hand, no luggage, no promise. Only the memory of a sentence written in trembling script, tucked in her breast like a secret too fragile for light. She is gone. I cannot see the dawn. And yet, she had come. Not to the ruins of Hawthorne, though she had passed close enough to smell the ghost of smoke in the soil. Not to the town square, where whispers still clung like ivy to stone. But to the edge of the forest, where the trees bent low and a crooked roof peeked between the limbs, as if the earth itself had chosen to shelter what the world had cast aside. The cottage stood like a wounded thing, sturdy but tired. Ivy climbed its stone walls. The shutters were slightly askew. A thin trail of smoke drifted from the chimney, curling into the grey sky like a sigh. She paused before the door, her hand hovering above the wood, and then she knocked. The sound echoed quietly. A pause, then slow steps within. The door creaked open. Agatha Penwell stood in the threshold, her face lined deeper than Sarah remembered, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. "I wasn't certain you'd come," Agatha said at last. "I wasn't either," Sarah replied. The housekeeper nodded once, then stepped aside. Inside, the air was warm, heavy with the scent of burning wood and something faintly herbal, lavender perhaps, or rosemary drying above the hearth. The space was small, but clean. A rocking chair by the fire, a worn rug, a small shelf of books, and silence, the kind that held breath rather than banished it. Sarah stepped forward. She saw him before he saw her. He sat in a wooden chair near the fire, his back straight, his face turned slightly toward the warmth. His hands rested on the arms of the chair, scarred, still. A thin band of linen covered his eyes. His hair was longer now, touched with silver. He did not speak, but Sarah saw his body shift, only slightly, almost imperceptibly, at her presence. Then he said her name. Sarah. It was not a question. It was recognition. She swallowed the lump in her throat. "You knew it was me?" "I know your silence." Agatha stepped back toward the kitchen, giving them the space of dignity. Sarah remained near the door for a moment longer, then slowly moved closer. She stood a few feet from him, her hands clasped in front of her. Her heart beat not with fear, but with something heavier. Grief, perhaps, or memory made flesh. "You wrote," she said softly. "I wrote many things," he replied. "Only one reached you." Silence settled between them like dust. She took another step forward. "Why did you not send the others?" "Because they were written for my shame, not for your forgiveness." She sat, not beside him but across, where she could see his face, though he could not see hers. The fire flickered between them, casting warm light on the hollows of his cheeks. "You didn't lie to me," she said. "You buried me in silence." He nodded. "And yet," she continued, "you asked me to marry you." He turned his head toward the sound of her voice. "I asked you to stay," he said, "because I was drowning, and you were the first breath I had taken in years." Sarah's throat tightened. "I would have stayed," she whispered, "had you told me the truth." "I know." She looked at him then, long and deeply. The face before her was no longer the proud, unreachable man who had once haunted the halls of Hawthorne. This was a man stripped bare. He had been burned by fire, by guilt, by grief, and yet he had endured. She asked the question she had carried for months. "Why didn't you send her away?" He was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke slowly. "Because I was afraid, not of her, of the world, of what they would do to her. She was ill, yes, but she was also brilliant, sensitive. She felt everything too deeply. When the child died, something in her soul fractured. The doctors spoke of institutions, of methods I could not abide. I chose to protect her, and in doing so, I destroyed us all." Sarah's voice trembled. "You destroyed her?" He nodded, a single movement. "Yes." The wind outside whispered through the trees, but inside the cottage, the fire crackled softly. "And Josette?" Sarah asked. "She knows," he said, "not everything, but enough. She knows Eleanor was her godmother, that she became unwell, that she loved music and roses and once sang her to sleep." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment. Then she opened them. "And the town? They call me cursed," he said with a trace of a smile. "They say Hawthorne burned because it could no longer bear its own sins. They offered no help, no prayers, only distance. And you remained. For Josette," he said, "and for penance." Sarah rose then and crossed the space between them. She knelt beside his chair. "I didn't come for apologies," she said. He turned his face toward her voice. "Then why did you come?" She reached for his hand, scarred, trembling, and placed hers over it. Because I never stopped hearing you." His breath caught. "You're not the same man," she said. "You are quieter, more honest, more broken." He bowed his head. "I have nothing to offer." She looked up at him, her voice soft but firm. "Then let us begin with nothing." A sound came from the hallway, tiny footsteps. Josette stood in the doorway, her nightdress wrinkled, her hair unbraided. She clutched a worn cloth rabbit in her arms. When her eyes met Sarah's, she did not speak. She simply ran to her. Sarah opened her arms, and the child melted into them. "You came back," Josette whispered. "Yes," Sarah murmured into her hair. "I came back." Jonathan reached forward blindly, and his hand found the edge of Sarah's skirt. The three of them stayed like that for a long time, beneath the hush of the forest, beside the fire that no longer threatened to consume, in a silence that finally spoke the truth. The days that followed Sarah's return unfolded in hushed patterns, like a tapestry slowly revealing its design with every careful stitch. The cottage nestled at the edge of the woods did not ask questions. Its walls accepted her presence the way the earth accepts rain, quietly, reverently. She came not as a governess, not as a bride, but as something in between, as a woman still learning what it meant to forgive and whether that forgiveness could begin with herself. Jonathan did not ask her to stay. He had done that once, and the silence that followed had nearly undone him. Now he simply allowed her to exist in the same space, each hour tethered by memory and possibility. Agatha gave her the guest room without ceremony. Josette clung to her hand whenever she could, as though afraid that one blink might make her disappear again. And Sarah, who had lived months breathing only the air of duty, now found herself breathing something different, something dangerously close to hope. But hope, like grief, was not linear. There were nights she sat by the small window and stared into the forest, wondering whether she had made the right choice. The village school still stood. Mr. Elmore still walked those streets with a quiet gentleness. There, life was structured, predictable. Children laughed, books waited. Her name was respected, her past remained unnamed. Here there was pain, scars that hadn't healed. A man who had once betrayed her trust now stumbled through the world with eyes that could no longer see but whose soul, perhaps, was finally learning how. She rose early each morning, before the fire was lit, before Josette stirred. She walked into the woods, letting the chill of the dawn anchor her body to the earth. She touched the bark of trees. She listened to birdsong. She remembered who she had been before Hawthorne and who she had become after it. And when she returned, she brought that clarity with her. One morning, she found Jonathan in the sitting room with Josette. The child sat across from him, a thick sheet of braille paper resting between them. Her small fingers brushed the raised dots, her lips forming words slowly, one syllable at a time. Jonathan sat stiffly, trying to follow her cadence. His hands hovered over the page, hesitant. "No," Josette said gently, placing her hand over his. "Like this." Sarah watched from the doorway. He leaned closer. "It feels like gravel." "It's words," she said. "You have to listen with your fingers." He tried again. His scarred hands moved across the paper with a painful awkwardness that made Sarah's chest ache, but he was trying. And in the silence between each word, she heard not failure, but determination. Later that night, Sarah sat by the hearth, darning one of Josette's stockings. Jonathan was nearby, silent, his presence like a shadow that warmed rather than darkened. He broke the quiet. "You should have stayed away." She didn't look up. "I tried." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Do you regret coming?" She paused. "No." That single word opened a space between them, small but real. "There are moments," she continued, setting the stocking aside, "when I wonder what might have become of me had I never crossed the gates of Hawthorne." "And what do you see?" "A woman still whole, still unknown." He shifted. Unknown to herself or to others? She looked at him then, and the question hung in the air like a challenge. "Both," she said. His sightless gaze remained fixed toward the fire. I wish I had met you before I became what I am. You're not what you were, she replied. That's the only reason I'm here. Josette entered then, barefoot and holding something wrapped in cloth. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes glowing with the kind of mischief children try to hide. I have something, she said quietly, crossing the room. Sarah tilted her head. What is it? Josette sat on the floor in front of Jonathan and unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a single braid of dark hair, hers from the time Sarah had first arrived at Hawthorne and trimmed the ends to start anew. I kept it, Josette said. Agatha said it wasn't proper, but I knew. She trailed off and took Jonathan's hand, pressing the braid into his palm. She said you would remember. Jonathan's fingers closed around the lock of hair, trembling. He bowed his head. I do, he whispered. Sarah's heart faltered. In that moment, the air around them shifted. The past, no longer a ghost, sat beside them, breathing its truth into the silence. The hair in his hand was not just memory. It was a promise, broken and now perhaps mending. That night, Sarah stood before the small mirror in her room. She let her hair down and studied her reflection in the flickering candlelight. Her face was the same, and yet not. Time had chiseled her edges. Grief had hollowed places she hadn't known existed. But in her eyes there was something new, an ember of strength not born from survival, but from choosing to return. She thought of the schoolhouse, the children's laughter, Mr. Elmore's kindness. She thought of Jonathan, fumbling over Braille. She thought of Josette, placing that braid into his hands as though placing back a piece of his soul. The next morning, Sarah packed a small bag. Jonathan heard her footsteps and turned toward her voice as she entered the sitting room. You're leaving? He asked. She shook her head, though he could not see it. I'm going to town, to retrieve my things. He said nothing, then, will you come back? She took a step forward. Yes, but not as a visitor. I'll come back when I know why I'm here. Not for you, not for Josette, for me. His expression was unreadable, but she sensed the breath he held. I'm not asking you to choose me, he said. I already did, she replied. Now I have to choose myself too. She turned to leave, and behind her, the fire crackled, not with threat, but with warmth. Outside, the forest opened. The wind carried her forward. She did not look back. She didn't need to, because sometimes the choice is not between two lives. It is choosing to finally live one. The morning she returned for good was neither dramatic nor grand. It arrived wrapped in mist, with dew glistening like tiny tears on every leaf and vine. The path through the forest remained unchanged, narrow, rooted, secretive. But Sarah Langdon walked it not as a visitor, not as a woman in exile, but as someone who had chosen to return from a place far deeper than distance. She carried only one valise. It held no dresses of silk, no jewelry, no lace. Inside were notebooks, a bound copy of Psalms in French and English, a child's watercolor drawing of a garden, and a shawl that still carried the faint scent of lavender. A woman does not return to her beginning with all her things, only with what the journey has allowed her to keep. The cottage appeared slowly through the fog, modest, humble, familiar. The shutters now hung straighter. The woodpile by the side had been replenished. Ivy had begun to grow across the stone wall again, as if nature itself had decided to try once more. Agatha opened the door before Sarah could knock. Her eyes, as always, revealed nothing, but her hands reached forward and took the bag without a word. She turned into the house, and Sarah followed, stepping across the threshold with a breath that felt both foreign and full. Josette was by the hearth, humming quietly as she drew with a bit of chalk on a worn slate. When she saw Sarah, she did not run this time. She simply looked up with wide eyes, then slowly placed the slate aside. She walked across the room, stood before her, and whispered, "You really came back." "I did," Sarah replied, kneeling to meet her. The child touched the edge of her sleeve, as if confirming her reality. "For how long?" Sarah smiled. "As long as you'll let me stay." Josette wrapped her arms around her, pressing her cheek against Sarah's shoulder, and did not let go. Behind them, a voice emerged, quiet, familiar, gravelled with time and memory. I heard the door. Jonathan stood in the doorway between the kitchen and sitting room, leaning lightly on the frame. The linen cloth no longer covered his eyes. Instead, they remained open, clouded with blindness but unhidden, accepting. "It's her," Josette said softly. "I know." Sarah rose slowly. She did not move toward him, nor he to her. They stood across the space, bound by something no longer broken, but not yet whole. "I have one condition," Sarah said. His jaw tightened, but he nodded. "No more secrets." He did not hesitate. Agreed. Still, he did not smile. Instead, he bowed his head, not in shame, but in reverence. "I'm not asking you to be what you were," she continued, "only to be what you are. And let me do the same." "I can promise that," he said. Then slowly, with hands that remembered rather than saw, he reached toward her. She stepped forward, and when he found her fingers, he knelt, not to propose, not for ceremony, but in gratitude. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice rough with sincerity, "for choosing me again." That spring, they were married in a chapel on the outskirts of town. It was not grand. No music played. No invitations were sent. But the bells rang gently as Sarah walked down the aisle with Josette's small hand in hers and a steady quiet in her heart. Jonathan waited at the altar with Agatha beside him, her hands folded, eyes bright beneath the brim of her black bonnet. The minister said the words, and they spoke their vows in low voices meant only for each other. They did not speak of eternity. They spoke of mornings, of truth, of patience, of the promise to never again pretend silence was love. After the ceremony, there was no feast. Only tea, a small cake, and a warm fire in their new home, a cottage of stone and timber a few miles from the forest's edge. The house had no ghosts, no hidden doors, no echoes of locked rooms. It breathed easily. Ivy crept across its walls. Sunlight filtered through wide-paned windows and rested on the floor as if it too had come to stay. Jonathan's days were slow but full. He learned to navigate their home by touch. Sarah read aloud to him in the evenings, sometimes poetry, sometimes news, sometimes nothing at all, just her voice, filling the space where silence once ruled. Josette learned to read Braille, and with small hands guided his over the pages. He wrote again, not letters this time, but small reflections he dictated and Sarah transcribed. Sarah too began to write. Her desk sat near a window where wild roses climbed. There, by the light of morning and the warmth of the fire, she began her memoir, not for the world, but for the girls who would come after her, girls who had been silenced, who had been lied to, who had been taught to carry other people's grief before their own joy. She titled it Ashes and Truth. In it she did not name Hawthorne directly, but she spoke of stone walls and quiet halls, of music never played and windows never opened. She wrote of a child who could not speak until someone knelt to listen, of a man who could not see until he closed his eyes, of a woman who had once mistaken silence for peace, and of a truth so long buried it had burned its way back into the light. In the afternoons, she and Josette walked through the woods to gather herbs or wildflowers. The child's hair had grown longer. Her laughter came more easily. She no longer asked about the fire. But when they passed the place where the old manor once stood, Sarah would pause, place a hand over her heart, and bow her head, not in mourning, in remembrance. The town in time accepted them, quietly, as it accepts most things. Some still whispered, others nodded politely, but no one dared question the strength of a woman who had returned without bitterness or apology. And no one could deny that whatever life had been rebuilt beyond the edge of the trees, it had been done with dignity. One night, near the first full moon of summer, Sarah stood in the garden with Jonathan beside her. The scent of roses filled the air, and fireflies danced like embers from a dream. "You once told me," she said, "that you had nothing to offer. He turned his head toward her, lips curving slightly. "I was wrong," she smiled, resting her head lightly against his shoulder. "You gave me freedom," she said, "and then you let me give it back." Inside the house, Josette's lullaby drifted through the open window. Sarah closed her eyes. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was sacred, and at last it spoke of peace. The year was 1859. The world beyond the forest had begun to stir in ways that once seemed unimaginable. Railroads cut through hills that had once known only hooves and hush. Women now gathered in parlors and reading circles, not just to stitch linens, but to question laws and whisper of change. The whispers were small still, but steady, like the first wind before a storm long awaited. But far from the tracks and towns, beyond a curved dirt road wrapped in pine and soft moss, a cottage still stood. The ivy had climbed higher now, curling gently along the eaves. Its roots had taken hold just as its inhabitants had, not with force, but with quiet devotion. The roof had been mended twice, the front door painted a pale blue. Children's laughter rang in the garden, where wild roses bloomed alongside mint and thyme. And near the window, a woman sat with her pen, as she always had, capturing the stories time tried to steal. Sarah Langdon Blackwell was now 33. Her face had changed with the years. Lines graced the corners of her eyes, and her gaze carried a tenderness laced with deeper wisdom. But her smile had only grown stronger, shaped by peace rather than pain. She had not abandoned writing. In fact, her memoir, Ashes and Truth, had been printed 5 years prior in a small Boston press run by women. It had passed from hand to hand quietly, discreetly, until it found a voice in places she would never see. Convent libraries, teachers' trunks, bedside drawers in farmhouses and boarding houses alike. Some called it radical, others called it salvation. She had written not just for girls, but for herself and for Eleanor, who never got to write her own ending. Inside the house, 2 children played on the floor, one with a wooden train, the other attempting to braid a doll's unruly yarn hair. Emma was 6, dark-haired and willful, born with Sarah's fire and Jonathan's patience. And Samuel, 4, was quieter, gentler, always looking to his sister before taking a step. They bore the name Blackwell, but they carried so much more. In the sitting room, Jonathan rested in his chair by the window. His eyes, long since blinded, remained open, soft with reflection. He had grown thinner, slower, but not weaker. He walked without a cane now, guided by memory and the small hands of children who called him Papa. His hair had gone fully silver, but his voice, when he read or dictated, still held its quiet command. He had never rebuilt Hawthorne. He had never wanted to. What he built instead was this: 4 walls, a warm fire, a home stitched not by grandeur but by truth. Josette was now 16, taller, bright. Her eyes still held that soft storm they had always carried, but now they danced too, especially when she played the pianoforte, her fingers flying across the keys Eleanor once loved. She called Sarah Mama now. She had done so for years, without being asked, on a spring morning when the past finally let her go. Agatha Penwell still lived with them, though age had slowed her steps. Her hair was white as snow, and her hands trembled as she sewed. But her gaze remained as steady as it had been the day Sarah first arrived at Hawthorne's door. It was she who watched over the children with an eagle's eye, who whispered Latin prayers over their foreheads at night, and who now rocked gently on the porch, a blanket across her knees. She had paid a price for her silence long ago. But she had paid it in years of loyalty, and now, in the weight of knowing she had helped mend what was broken. Not all had been forgiven, not all had been forgotten, but peace had made its home here, and it had stayed. On the mantel stood a single photograph taken by a traveling daguerreotypist from Charleston. In it, Jonathan sat with his arm around Sarah, his face turned slightly toward hers. Josette stood behind them, hands on their shoulders, and in Sarah's lap sat a baby, Emma, then only months old. The image had faded some with sun and time, but the love in it had not. One afternoon, as golden light poured in through the windows, Jonathan sat in his chair with little Samuel in his lap. Sarah watched them from the doorway, her hands dusted with flour from baking. "Tell me again," the boy said, curling into his father's chest. "How Mama saved you." Jonathan smiled. "No," he said gently. "She didn't save me, she saw me, and that saved everything else." Later that evening, when the children were tucked into bed and Josette played softly in the background, Sarah and Jonathan sat on the porch beneath a rising moon. He reached for her hand as he always did, by feel, by instinct. "I think of her often," he said quietly. Sarah nodded. "So do I. Do you think she would have forgiven me?" he asked. Sarah paused, then replied, "I think she already has." He turned his face toward hers. "And you?" She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I did, the moment you stopped hiding." They stayed like that until the stars came out, no longer in mourning for what had been lost, but in deep gratitude for what had been rebuilt, brick by brick, breath by breath. And in that cottage, surrounded by ash-born roses, laughter, and the echoes of a house that once held only silence, love endured, not as illusion, but as truth. And truth, once chosen, never burns. It only shines. And so, dear listener, the story of Sarah Langdon and Colonel Jonathan Blackwell comes to a close. But perhaps in truth, it's not an ending, because what we just witnessed was not only a romance born from longing and silence, but a rebirth forged in truth, forgiveness, and the courage to return, not to what was, but to what could be. Through betrayal and sorrow, through fire and distance, we saw two souls strip away illusion and face one another not with pride, but with vulnerability. And from that, they built something stronger than a manor of stone. They built a life rooted in presence, in honesty, in love rebuilt not on dreams, but on ashes. Maybe that is the lesson we carry today, that love is not perfection, that peace is not silence, and that beginnings are often found not in grand arrivals, but in the quiet moment someone says, "You can come back if you want to." If this story stirred your heart, left you breathless, or brought even a single tear to your eyes, we would love to hear from you. Tell us in the comments what part touched you the most. And if you made it to the very end, leave the word Ivy in your comment. It's our secret way of knowing who stayed with us through every chapter, every sigh, every shadow. If you feel moved to support the team that lovingly creates these historical tales, you can send a super thanks here on YouTube with whatever amount you feel called to give. It helps us continue crafting stories like this with the care and passion they deserve. But if that's not possible right now, simply sharing this video with someone who loves emotional, timeless romances is more help than you can imagine. Stories live through those who pass them on. And don't forget, there are more unforgettable journeys waiting for you. I've left similar tales in the cards above, just one click away. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts for choosing to walk this path with us. We hope it stays with you, like ivy climbing slowly, quietly, enduringly through every season.